The single most important thing you can do for your comic is laying it out properly. Without a proper layout, you will lose bits of your artwork or speech bubbles when it comes to printing, and if you're going for digital only, you may end up cropping out bits of your story. We're going to walk through some of the things you're going to want to need to know about when it comes to preparing your comic for both print and digital uploads. So let's start with bleed. Bleed is probably the number one thing that printers get frustrated about when they receive comics. If you don't consider the bleed of your comics, then vital bits of it are going to end up on the cutting room floor. So what is it? Well, bleed is the area of the canvas that is going to be cut up when printed. So if you have any panels that go to the edge of the page, then these panels need to be pushed beyond the size of the canvas. If you don't have any panels that do this, you still need to think about bleed so that your panels don't butt up against the edge of the page. I found that the best program to use to lay out your comic is Adobe's InDesign, but it's not the only option, so we'll talk about them too. With InDesign, you can set up the bleed pretty easily. When creating a new document, the bleed setting is right here. The default is 3mm, which is plenty of room. Just make sure that the 3mm is across all sides of the canvas and you're good to go. And to give a visual demonstration of what I mean by bleed, we've got some panels on the page here, and this area of the canvas is the bleed. If you think this page will come out okay, then you're ignoring the bleed, because when that area gets cut, this is what it looks like. Now the panels are right up against the page and it isn't going to turn out like you hoped. But not everyone has InDesign, and that's fair enough. Well, if you use Clip Studio, you're in luck, because setting up bleed here works exactly the same way. The main difference is that the default size is 5mm instead of 3. 5 is probably fine too, but I tend to stick with 3 and haven't run into any problems so far. The final program I'll mention is Photoshop, because there isn't a way to set up bleed like with the previous two programs. If there is, I don't know how to do it. Don't worry though, because figuring out the bleed and applying it is pretty simple. It just involves basic maths. You can change the measurements of your canvas here, so you can switch it from whatever it is to millimeters. Make sure that the canvas is the actual page size when you do this, so everything is accurate. Now just add 6mm to the width and 6mm to the height. Why 6 and not 3? Because the width refers to the left and right, and the height refers to the top and bottom, which means 3 times 2, which is 6. Maths. Anyway, that's the basics of bleed. It's easy to implement, but also easy to forget. So make it a habit even if you're not intending to print and are only going for digital uploads. You never know when you may want to print stuff in the future. When you're roughing out your comic, it's worth doing a test print of a page or two to make sure your document is set up correctly. One of the most horrible things in the world is doing all of that work and realizing you need to resize everything, which could ruin the comic. So it's worth taking the time. And that's the print side sorted out, so let's talk about webcomics. I'm going to use Tapas and Webtoon as the examples here. There are other sites that host webcomics, but these are two of the biggest and two I've used in the past. If you've never made a webcomic before, the setup is a certain width and an unlimited height. That's because webcomics have a vertical scroll. These sites will have the width guides for you to look at, so make sure you check before you start. For a more detailed breakdown of the dimensions, check out this video I did on comic book dimensions and you'll be good to go. Clip Studio Paint has a setting for webcomics which is super helpful, so you can choose whichever one applies to you. The maximum height is 50,000 pixels, although this isn't necessary unless you're making a really long story. You can always increase or decrease it as you go. Now, when it comes to DPI or PPI, which stands for dots per inch and pixels per inch respectively, most of the time you don't need to go higher than 72. That's been the wisdom of the internet for many years now, but with screens becoming more advanced, you may want to increase it to 150 at a minimum. But with all that being said, you may want to work at a DPI of 300 or more in case you want to print it down the line. Going from big to small is much easier and less destructive than going from small to big. When it comes to the actual layout of the webcomic, this is where you can get pretty creative. Your biggest weapon when it comes to storytelling is the spaces between the panels. You tend to have one panel stacked on top of one another, and you can either increase or decrease the space between them depending on the type of effect you're going for. For example, if you wanted to show a longer passage of time, you may want to increase the space between the panels. It's not just the space between the panels that you can get creative with though. You can also offset the panels so they're not uniform anymore. You can also crop some of the panels or tilt them or do pretty much anything that your imagination comes up with. The final point to remember is that if this is your first comic, make it short. You will probably screw something up when it comes to printing or uploading online, even if you're super careful and have checked everything. And the best way to learn is by screwing up. So it's better to make your mistakes on a project that took 1 month to make as opposed to one that takes a few years. Just remember, bleeds, work bigger than you need to, and keep everything organized and you'll have a good time. We're going to look at sound effects next week, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I've been Brinkley, have fun drawing, and I'll see you next week.